issue 3 and issue 6. I understand that people are here for both issues around the table. So starting with issue 3, is the distribution of employment land in the plan justified in light of the distribution of housing? And this is an issue that's come out of the representations largely, and my question is fairly general, and as it's shown on the agenda, so whether the balance of housing and employment in the garden towns and elsewhere in the district is appropriate and will minimise the need for commuting. So can I just ask the council to address that point first of all, and how that's been confirmed by the evidence before going around the table? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. As you say, this is cross-cutting in many matters that we're dealing with, but as set out in the council's Matter 4 hearing statement, particularly paragraph 14, we do consider that the balance of housing and employment in the garden town and across the district is appropriate, and that it will minimise the need for commuting. The council's strategy for the distribution of employment land in the plan supports growth and regeneration at Harlow. It also ensures the broader district's needs are addressed, and it facilitates employment growth opportunities. We are confident that this accords with the evidence available, which is predominantly the Employment Review 2017, which is EB 603, and the West Essex and East Herts Assessment of Employment Needs, which is EB 610. And that sets out in relation to the employment needs of the district and the FEMA, the Functional Economic Market Area. So the Council's employment strategy makes provision for employment where new homes are to be provided, also where there is market appetite to develop, and where the level of traffic growth generated can be managed, such as to minimise pressure on the roads that adjoin the Epping Forest Special Area of Conservation. Thank you.
Okay, did anyone else want to raise any issues about this? Okay, thank you. Ms. Osborne.
Thank you, ma'am. My concerns relate to Nazing. I share many of the concerns that were raised this morning about its position in the hierarchy. I find it very difficult to accept that it is actually a small village. And particularly in that regard, it has a parade of shops, which only accords it 1 point, whereas I'd have thought a parade certainly warrants more than that. But looking specifically at employment, as the council statement says at paragraph 21, Loughton and Waltham Abbey are the most important employment centres, with about 37 hectares each. I'm not sure how much of that is actually existing and how much allocated, but I suspect a substantial proportion is existing. But third after those two comes Nazing, with over 13 hectares of employment land, all of which exists, and all of which, from my observations, is generally well used and is popular in the employment market. And yet, despite this, the allocation for housing in Nazing has dropped between the Regulation 18 and 19 plan from 220 down to 122. So whilst I welcome the Council's several comments this morning that balancing employment and residential growth is important, it seems to me that with regard to Nazing, that hasn't been achieved. In their paragraph 22 statement, the Council says that there are a number of existing employment locations close to the village. However, many of the businesses are in the agricultural and horticultural sectors, are largely dispersed and rural in character, and have a limited relationship with the village or its role and function. I think this is only true in part. Of the 7 sites that are designated in policy P10, which goes from Naze E1 through to Naze E7, none of these are agricultural, horticultural. They are all straightforward B1, B2, B8 industrial sites. There are some very large horticultural sites on the edge of the village. You've got Tom World at Shoppington's Farm, which probably employs in excess of 80 people. Valley-grown salads at Sedge Green, valley-grown nurseries to the south of the village, all of which no doubt make significant contributions to employment. I wouldn't have expected them to be allocated as employment sites, but I'm just making the point that I don't think the council can justify its position on the basis of saying the employment is peripheral to the village when there are actually important employment sites within the village itself. And just briefly in terms of the sustainability of Nazing, the actual crossroads, which is regarded as the centre of the village, is just 1.5 miles from Broxbourne Station, which is on the main line through to Liverpool Street and connecting to Stansted Airport. And just one final point, at paragraph 30C, the council states that whilst it is acknowledged that Nazing and Thornwood are categorised as small villages, they benefit from a greater pool of potentially suitable, available and deliverable sites and are less constrained compared with some other settlements. So I fail to see how that fits with the downgrading from 220 to 122 dwellings. Thank you.
So your concern is that the employment base in Nazing would support more housing?
Absolutely.
Both there?
Yes.
Thank you. Well.
Thank you, Mum. My comments are in the context of some of the discussions that you had 2 weeks ago in relation to the quantum of both housing and employment land, and the discussions that we had this morning in relation to the spatial distribution of housing. It seems to me that there is an inconsistency in the approach that has been taken. And we've made reference to that in our hearing statement, particularly paragraphs 2.6 and 2.8, in that there was a lot of criticism of the Council this morning in adopting a Harlow-centric approach to the delivery of housing. But that has not played out at all in the context of the identification of 5 sites for employment in the plan. Our argument would be that limits the flexibility of the plan in delivering suitable employment to deal with the growth, not just in Epping, but in and around Harlow. And the over-reliance on the regeneration of employment sites in Harlow, again, is an inflexible approach. The site that we have been promoting at Junction 7 of the M11 sits on a main transport corridor. It has easy access to both Epping and Harlow, and indeed Northfield Bassett, when thinking about it. Has the opportunity to tap into and enhance public transport facilities. And in that context, the assessment of the site, there was no transparency as to why elements of that, which the council had as part of our evidence base, have been ignored. I think I think the strategy that has been adopted will lead to unsustainable patterns of transport. They probably already exist. But the strategy doesn't seem to enhance or make use of the opportunities that public transport provides. Thank you.
Mr. Stamp.
Thank you. I note what the Officer of the Council said this morning about 1256 about balancing housing and jobs is an important consideration. I suggest it's a very important consideration in terms of sustainability. I don't see, and I happen to live in Epping and don't work, a jobs workers balance evident, and particularly not in Epping, which is, as you'll be aware, receiving the largest number of new homes of any settlement in the district. I've got concerns about that in terms of reducing the need to travel, government policy, favouring active travel, walking and cycling, and the health benefits which can arise from particularly those latter modes, and also gains in productivity, which is a nationally known problem, very hard to fix, which can be gained from not sitting in a car for so long. I see in your matters, issues and questions, there's a question about should the plan have job numbers, not just employment land. I think it probably should, so you can tell where there is going to be a rough jobs workers balance. It hasn't got to be precise, but some stab at it. Particularly in Epping, there is a problem that, yes, there's a large number of housing numbers proposed, but not all employment sites have been retained, some which could well have been and are most adaptable for redevelopment for alternative uses. The other half of the civic offices, as you come in off the road on the left-hand side, also offices proposing to go to housing. So actually the amount of employment land in Epping is going down while the housing numbers are going up substantially. Also, I see in the messages and questions, it's on retail, given that not all employment, by any stretch of imagination, is B1, B2, B8. With the plan saying that 40% of retail is going to be outside the district, okay, I don't dispute that. But it doesn't give an indication of the 6% remaining in the district, what split that might be between convenience and comparison. And as far as I could see, there are no land allocations for that, which also ties into town centres and what town centres might be used for in places like Epping. So there are a number of opportunities for jobs, but we don't know where there's a balance, where they might arise, and some are sites which are either in active employment use or could easily be redeveloped for high density employment uses are being taken out. Sorry, I just don't think that's sustainable.
Mr Butcher and then Mr Hill.
Ma'am, just as far as North Weald Bassett is concerned, I think it's quite important to point out that the council have taken an approach of providing a vision for North Weald Bassett, which is not just linked to housing. We talked about these matters very briefly this morning, but I would draw attention to the vision for North Weald Bassett and also the fact that it will have, well, I was going to say the second highest, but actually it's equally high, largest allocation for new employment in the district. And I think that sort of links neatly into the council's aspirations for North Weald. And whilst the master plan for North Weald Airfield is a matter for the council, what I can say to you is that as part of our work, as part of the North Weald Plan residential area, we will be looking at ways of connectivity between our site and the airfield in order to go towards the council's aspirations for the vision for North Weald, the employment land, and the idea that it should be self-sustaining in terms of not just employment but leisure uses and other uses as well.
Mr Hill.
Thank you, ma'am. 4 short points with emphasis on the garden town element of the question that you raise. Firstly, I'm sure it's axiomatic that there are no strict rules that one applies to the balance between housing and employment, and one will have to look in each case at the context and surrounding circumstances. Second point, for the Harlow sites, one needs to be aware, of course, that the Garden Town sites cluster around Harlow itself, which contains very substantial employment opportunities, and indeed which contains Essex's only enterprise zone at the present time. Third, so far as the Latin Priory site is concerned, there is a specific employment element of that proposed at Dorrington Farm. There's also, of course, 3.3 hectares of local centre, which will itself generate jobs, and then the 3 schools over 13 hectares, which again will be a generator of employment. And my fourth of these short points is simply that we think, in broad terms, it's right that the emphasis with the Garden Town sites should be on housing, with a careful eye to the fact that they cluster around this major sub-regional employment hub at Harlow.
So Ms Bryan.
Thank you. I just wanted to echo what Mr Butcher said about the vision for North Weald being very much about employment and housing together. And just to add that putting these 2 uses together will sort of significantly reduce out-commuting from North Weald by providing the employment in the same location, rather than the current pattern of out-commuting towards Epping.
Thank you. Mr Sprunt.
I think it's worth just clarifying our position on our hearing statement, which has developed further from then. As you're probably aware, our concerns related primarily to the Garden Town as opposed to the wider market area, which we're fundamentally comfortable with. However, our concerns relate to the Garden Town, which has not been considered as an entity within this. It wasn't a question that was asked of the FEMA review. It does cross multiple boundaries, obviously across Harlow and also East Herts. And we consider that as part of the Garden Town, it needs potentially a step change in how employment is considered to allow the internalisation of trips, which will achieve our levels of sustainability, which I think many will consider are quite aspirational for the levels that we're looking at. I think, contrary to what maybe has just been said, there is a view supported by the Town and Country Planning Association, Guidelines for Garden Town, which sets a target of at least one job per home to achieve the sorts of levels of sustainability that we're looking for in the garden town. At the moment, the levels are around about sort of 50% of that level. However, we do recognise that the garden town itself is in the process of commissioning a piece of work specifically to look at the employment needs of the garden town. And on the basis of this, provided the outcomes of this piece of work, be that the numbers are sufficient at the moment or indeed need to be greater, these would be considered as part of the 5-year review of the plan. Bearing in mind that the 5-year review would probably be, as we heard this morning, around about the time that first homes across the strategic site would start to be occupied. From our view, we're therefore comfortable with the current position on that basis.
And what could be the response if it were found that more employment land was needed in 5 years' time? How much flexibility would there be to deal with that then?
We'd need to look at where it could potentially go. There's been some suggestions today as to potential sites, but there are other ones around the area where it could be allocated, be that intensification potentially in Harlow if that was possible, or around the fringes as well. So I think that just needs to be considered at that time.
Mr. Stamp, did you have anything more to say?
Please, yes, just not to be too NIMBY or parochial, and looking at the wider picture in terms of where there's an imbalance or not. A large amount of jobs going at North Weald, which may well involve travelling through the Triple SI by vehicular means, or Waltham Abbey, travelling through the SAC by vehicular means. While there's a big issue I referred to earlier about jobs-workers balance, it would be quite possible to improve that by terms of modifications, just by swapping some of the smaller land allocations around so that some employment land, for example, this town was reinstated as protected, and some of the housing which was destined for there would go at perhaps one of those other two main settlements which is getting more employment numbers. It is actually quite resolvable on a small scale, which would be an improvement. Whether the other larger scale issues could be solved is probably more in terms of the transport issue coming later or the other matter.
Mr. Barber, before we turn back to the council.
Thank you, Mum. Just coming back on the point, the question you asked Mr. Sprunt about the opportunities to review should the Garden Town work identify the need for more employment land. The only formal process open to the authority would be to review the plan. There's no flexibility in the plan to provide for that in the current context of the plan, and therefore would require either a partial or whole-scale review. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, several points have been raised around the table. Perhaps if we could ask you first to address the points made by Mrs. Osborne in Nazing.
Thank you, Madam. Yes, I'll start with the Nazing point. Firstly, just to emphasise that all the sites that have come forward to the council have been considered through a site selection process, which mirrors that of housing. In terms of the balance at Nazing, in terms of employment and residential, there was, as you've heard, a reduction to the number of homes being proposed at Nazing, and that was specifically to address representations received regarding the impact of allocations on heritage assets. So I think that was English Heritage that had raised some concerns. Historic England. There is a reference for that if you'd like it. This within the site selection report, which is EB 805, and that's page 47. If I can go on to address some of the other issues raised. I think it's important to reiterate some of the discussion that was had a couple of weeks ago at the previous session in terms of the quantum of needs and the approach taken within the plan. The council has considered very carefully the evidence both at the FEMA level and at the district level in terms of how much employment space should be allocated and where that space should be allocated. In terms of the overall needs across the FEMA, that has resulted in a requirement for between 16 to 19 hectares of employment land within Epping Forest District. The plan itself, through the 5 allocations, which are set out on page 65, table 3.1 of the local plan submission version, provides for 23 hectares. So contrary to what you've just heard, there is flexibility in the plan over and above the level that the evidence suggests is required. And in addition, there is requirements in policy, various policy requirements for small-scale employment uses to come forward within master plan areas. We also discussed previously about the rise in home working and the likely implications of that. In terms of the issues around the Garden Town, and particularly you've heard from Mr Sprunt from Essex County Council about their concerns, and he's quite right that we've had some further discussions in light of their representations and objections, and there is a statement which is nearing completion, which will be with you hopefully in a matter of days, which will confirm a joint position moving forward, which reflects what Mr Sprunt explained to you. In terms of the actual sort of shape in terms of how it relates to housing and the overall provision, our Matter 8 hearing statement, which I appreciate you won't have read yet, but that goes into some detail about this, which is on pages 15 to 17. So I appreciate we'll be coming back to that at a later date, but I think it's important to be aware of that. Within that, there's specific reference to the work of the sustainability appraisal in how that considered employment needs and employment distribution across the district. And that, particularly paragraph 7.48 of the sustainability appraisal, which is EB 204, I won't read it, but there's a very helpful paragraph there which summarises the conclusions around the spatial distribution of employment sites and how it's reflected the evidence that's available.
Thank you. Does that cover the wider district beyond the Garden Towns?
Yes, it does.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. If I could just comment what Mr Coleman said. Yes, I concurred entirely with the comments from English Heritage about sites on the southern side of the village. I made similar comments myself and actually welcome the fact that those allocations have been reduced. Indeed, I'm not sure that they should be there at all. My point is that there is land which is not constrained in terms of heritage impact or landscape impact on the northern side of the town, which I don't feel northern side of the village, which I don't feel has been thoroughly assessed and which I think could very readily be brought forward. Thank you.
Just one last question on unemployment from me. Have you done anything to look at potential commuting patterns in light of where the employment and the housing are located?
I think we're probably better coming on to this shortly when we have our transport consultant with us. But yes, it has been factored into the transport assessment work. But I'm sure he'll be able to explain better than I how that's been factored in.
Thank you. That might be a useful time to move on to issue 6, if anyone, unless there's anything more specific someone wants to say about employment. No. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, yep, a couple of minutes, it's fine. On my part earlier, as I noticed a few new faces around the table and didn't ask anyone to introduce themselves, so I apologise for that. But I think most people were here this morning, and we have Mr. Barber, who I've noted, who spoke. But I do see there are a few new faces now which weren't here this morning, so I think it would be useful if we could just go round quickly. If I start with the council, thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam. I'm Mark Beard. I'm a barrister instructed by the council. Helping us today for this session, Mr. Coleman will be leading. Who sits to my right. To his right is Mr. Simon James from Jacobs, a new face, and to his right, Ms. Alison Blom-Keeper, and behind me here, Ms. Nikki Linehan, consultant who has helped us in particular with the mitigation strategy as well.
David Sprunt from Essex County Council.
Mary Young, Essex County Council.
Paul Burley from Montague Evans, representing Quinn Estates.
Katie Ingalls from Iceni Projects, representing Telelands Improvement.
Michael Lewin, Transport Planning Practice, representing Telelands Improvement.
Paul Belton, also representing Pigeon Management.
Henry Stamp, individual.
Jeremy Dagley from the Conservators of Epping Forest.
Tony Asprey Planning on behalf of Freetown Homes.
Good afternoon, Ma'am. Sam Hollingworth, Stratton Park, representing Crowd Ace Homes.
Tom Hill, Queen's Counsel for Commercial Estates Group and Helen Land.
Good afternoon again, Ma'am. Stephen Koski, Turley, representing Land Fund, Waltham Abbey Limited.
Good afternoon, Julia Riddle, Castle Planning on behalf of Loughton Town Council.
Chris Pond, Councillor at Loughton Town Council.
Thank you for that, and apologies for not doing it earlier. So we're moving on to issue 6 now, which is the distribution of development justified in respect of its effect upon transport and other infrastructure in the district, and will the plan be effective in securing the infrastructure necessary to support proposed growth? Now, I would like to focus on my first 2 bullet points concerning the transport evidence to start with, but then I think perhaps the final bullet points concerning the IDP, the infrastructure delivery plan, perhaps the transport elements of that might be better taken together with the other elements of infrastructure, as the points will overlap, I think, to some extent. But first of all, if we I'd just like, for my benefit, if the council could clarify the role of the 2017 highway assessment and the 2019 transport assessment report, the TAR, for plan making purposes. So if you can just explain how those have been used to support this submission plan, and perhaps if you could help me with whether any adjustments are needed as a result of the findings of the TAR. Thank you. Thank you.
I mean, in the first instance, no changes to the plan are required as a result of the Transport Assessment Report. The key updates to the Transport Assessment Report are set out in paragraph 2.2.2 on page 6, and that's at EB 503. And the key findings are set out within section 13 on pages 101 to 104. The TA reports on an enhanced modelling methodology and provided a more detail on the potential highway mitigation schemes compared with the Highway Assessments Report of 2017 at EB 502. Table 8.2 on page 59 and paragraph 8.4.3 of the TAR provide a high-level summary of the changes in modelling outputs between the 2 documents. These show there were negligible differences in the traffic flows across the network as a result of this enhanced methodology.
Can you just sort of explain why this new enhanced methodology was required? Why was this report done if it essentially hasn't found anything different, I suppose, to the previous version?
It's part of the iterative process of modelling assessment and leading up into the evidence base. I mean, just looking at the key updates, just to give you a sort of broad overview of what they were, we looked at updating assumptions around rail heading for vehicle trips. The previous assumptions based on journey to work data perhaps underestimated the level of car trips to town centre locations around railway stations and London Underground stations. So we looked at this to try and enhance that part of the methodology. We also updated our TEMPRO assumptions to be more consistent with wider air quality work that was being undertaken for the SAC and the Habitats Regulation Assessment. This looked at including the most up-to-date growth assumptions in neighbouring authorities, as well as some of the London boroughs. We also factored in road traffic forecasts for LGV or light goods vehicles and heavy goods vehicles as well, again, just to make it more robust. We also, in acknowledgement of the policy for car-free, potential car-free and reduced car parking levels at some sites, housing sites and employment sites in close proximity to underground stations. We looked at adjusted trip rates for those sites as well. The overall junction modelling software that we used a fairly arbitrary demand profile, and we looked at more up-to-date traffic data around the network to adjust how we did the junction assessments that fed into the overall assessment. Perhaps the most important one is we took the mitigation package of highway improvements that was set out in the highway assessment report and developed that into a more concept designs, taking in a bit more of a view of what the constraints were and their deliverability. By no means detailed design, but giving a bit more confidence in those. And as a sort of proportional assessment, we undertook what's called a peak spreading assessment, which is set out in DMR, or the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges, and also Transport Appraisal Guidance, which is all DFT guidance, which looks at the redistribution of traffic at the most congested times on the network into available capacity in the adjoining peak hours, to see what the potential impact of that could be on the network as well. Essentially, as I said, the implications of these adjustments to the methodology added some additional growth into the model, but also took some growth out in key locations, particularly around the car-free. Overall, when we looked at the changes in traffic flows between the assessments from 2017 to 2018, we were looking at less than 1% change. At some of the key locations or junction assessments, there was changes of sort of between 1% and 4% in traffic flows there. Some reductions around sites, specifically around Loughton, but potentially some increases as well around tube stations.
If I just ask my one other question, because this has come up from somewhere, and then we'll go around the table and the council can come back to you. The questions have been raised about the assumptions made by the TAR and the transport model about reductions in car use district-wide and at the garden towns in Harlow. Could you explain what those are and whether they're realistic and what the implications would be if they perhaps weren't realised to the full extent?
Yep. So just as a bit of background, there are two modelling methodologies. There's a wider strategic model which is being used currently to test the garden towns. And then at a district level, we used a more proportionate assessment methodology with a spreadsheet model which drew on some of the strategic modelling principles. More details of these are included in the HAR in section 2, paragraph 2.1.1 to 2.1.7 on pages 4 and 5, and also in the Transport Assessment Report, section 3, paragraphs 3.1.1 to 3.1.7 on pages 8 to 9. So essentially, the focus of the local plan submission version is based on the district-wide modelling. The methodology used to develop the assumptions for the modelling and the development proposed in the local plan and relating to the anticipated reductions in car use in the district, including garden town communities within the Epping Forest district, can be found in the Highway Assessment Report, section 3.4, pages 12 and 13, and Transport Assessment Report, section 6.4, pages 35 to 40. Whilst it's acknowledged that the ambition for 60% of trips to and from or associated with the garden town communities to be made by non-car modes is acknowledged in 2.117, page 38 of the local plan submission version, this was not used as an assumption in the district-wide modelling. The median sustainability scenario assumed an average of an approximate 5% reduction from existing levels in car use for the local plan submission version development sites, which, as with other elements of the transport modelling, represent a precautionary approach.
Sorry, and just to clarify, is that that's just for new sites? Is it?
Yeah,
that's not assuming any change in the existing population?
No factors have been made for background traffic or existing, so there's potential for further modal shift there, which hasn't been tested. Just going back to the precautionary approach, which was set out in the EFDC's Matter 4 hearing statement at paragraph 100 concerning the issue 6, question 1. Moving on to the assumptions. The assumptions used for the modelling purposes are realistic, given that they have been based on trip rates which have an Essex focus. If you see the Highways Assessment, paragraph 4.5, page 13, and the TAR, paragraph 6.5.7, page 38, and take account of the variation in locations of proposed development, for example, town centre, edge of town centre, suburban, and so on. And they've also taken into account a range of sustainable transport measures, including the scope to improve the frequency of bus services in parts of the district, the future capacity of the central line indicated by Transport for London, and a range of identified cycle and walking improvements. Furthermore, as previously stated, the assessments to date have not factored in the higher levels of modal shift being planned for the garden town communities, and therefore, as we've already said, be considered precautionary. The precautionary nature of these assumptions means that there is very little prospect of the assumed reductions in car use not being realised. Rather, as set out in paragraph 13.1.4 of the TAR on page 101, it would be reasonable to assume that more ambitious modal shift could be realised with the level of intervention or measures proposed, and potentially bettered given the garden town aspirations at the strategic sites around Harlow. However, if the implications of these are not met, a greater level of support for sustainable transport measures would be needed, or the physical highway measures that have been identified in the Highway Assessment Report at table 3.8 on pages 22 and 23, and the Transport Assessment Report Appendix F would potentially need to be brought forward earlier in the plan period. While further transport modelling work has been undertaken to support the garden town communities based on the most up-to-date emerging or adopted local plans for the housing market area authorities, the outputs of this work are not yet available.
Okay, so just to be clear for me, the 5% reduction that has been assumed that for the development sites, that's for all new development sites across the district, including the garden towns. Is that right?
That's correct,
That's correct. And what are the higher aspirations that you referred to?
The highest aspirations are in the emerging technical notes 7, which I believe hasn't been published yet, but we're looking at the methodology looked at intermediate levels of modal shift, which was still fairly improving on existing standards, existing levels, sorry. This looks at 60% car share in the most accessible areas, and 65% car share. That's a reduction from the existing level of 76% in and around the Harlow area. And then there's the more ambitious targets, which is looking at 40% car share in the areas with the best access to the sustainable corridors and transport interventions, and 45% in the less accessible areas, again coming down from the 76%.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Lewin.
Taking your first point about the two transport assessments, these comments are particularly in relation to Epping. So when we've looked at that, there are significant increases predicted in both transport reports.
Would you speak?
Can you hear? Sorry.
Sorry.
There are significant increases predicted in congestion in Epping in both the transport reports. And the real difference, as far as we can see, between the first report and the second report is that the second report now proposes some transport solutions. For instance, in Epping, they're talking about improvements to the Wakes Arm junction, at Faden Road with High Road, and at Berry Lane. All of those improvements require forest land or common land. So obviously there needs to be some discussion, I would have thought, with the forest about this, whether or not that's possible. There are other junctions in Epping that are congested at the moment, but they haven't been considered in those transport reports. So no solutions are identified for those. And even with those solutions that require forest land, significant investment in sustainable modes or sustainable transport to achieve modal shift, which really isn't defined at all in those reports. There are no serious measures mentioned, and in fact the County Council have mentioned that in their representations, that they're concerned about the lack of detail on sustainable transport improvements. And then they've gone on to assume peak spreading, which really means, converted to the layman, is that congestion will exist at the same levels or greater for longer periods of the day. And they've made a reduction in trip rates for housing of about a third to allow for that. So obviously you can see that congestion in Epping will just get worse and occur for much longer periods of the day. And a further thing they've allowed for here is car-free housing, and they've made a 80% reduction in trips for car-free and reduced car housing. But even with all those improvements, the junctions in the area are still over capacity. And just a point to make on a couple of these things, particularly car-free housing, is that many councils are now moving away from car-free and reduced car housing. The reason being is it doesn't necessarily discourage car use, but what it does result in is a poor environment with people parking on verges, other adjacent streets, etc., etc. So lots of councils are moving away from that. So really, to finish on that point, the future for Epping at the moment appears to be more congestion over longer periods of the day, with no solutions identified in the local plan to solve any of that. We are aware that there might be a solution out there. The council previously looked at Relief Road, but that's not considered in the local plan at all, or in the local plan evidence. So that deals with the congestion element. On what reductions they're making for sustainable travel, the report claims that they've reduced trip rates by 15 to 22%. But again, as you can see, that there really are no measures identified in the plan to actually achieve that, and certainly no strategic planning at all. But actually, when you look at the trip rates in the transport assessment, they appear to be reduced by about 46 to 26%, so higher than their claim. I'm not Sure, maybe they'll want to come back on that, but certainly my calculations of their trip rates versus what they're saying give two different answers. So really, I mean, when we've spoken to the county council about that, they've mentioned towns in Holland, such as, well, not Freiburg, Freiburg's in Germany, but the big difference between how they achieve modal split shift towards sustainable modes and here is that they actually take a proper strategic look at transport. They don't say, oh, we'll improve sustainable transport later on by talking to developers and coming up with some measures. They set out with a plan from the very beginning. And for instance, Freiburg, that's been quoted, has a tram network and has over 400 kilometres of cycle route. So you don't just achieve sustainable transport overnight or by on an ad hoc basis later. You achieve it through real strategic planning, which doesn't seem to be part of this plan.
Sorry, before we move on, perhaps we could just address some of the points that Mr. Lewin has raised, particularly when he talks about congestion and identifying that the junctions in Epping will still be over capacity. Is that correct? And how does that fit with the report concluding that planned levels of growth can be accommodated from a transport perspective?
Yeah, I think the transport assessment report and the highways assessment report do acknowledge that there will be levels of congestion, as with a lot of plans where a large amount of growth is expected on the network. I mean, just taking some of the points. Sorry, I think your name, Mike, yeah. Mr. Lewin. Sorry. I mean, we have set out sustainable transport measures in section 7 of the Transport Assessment Report, in consultation with Essex County Council in terms of the potential for bus route improvements and links through Epping up to Harlow, North Weald, and North Weald to Harlow, linking in with the proposed sustainable transport corridors over there. We're building on the Essex-wide and Epping cycle action plans, which looks at a comprehensive network of on-road and off-road routes through the settlements in the Epping area, the district area. And also there's the increased capacity on the central line, which can be capitalised on, changes in employment towards the east of London and how the use of the central line can be capitalised on that. The 15 to 22% modal shift that you quote is taken from previous assessments of the local plan that fed into early iterations of the testing process where particularly high default trips rates were used to test different plan options thoroughly and robustly. We then undertook through the HAR and the TAR a more local, realistic assessment and used a tool called EPTAL, which is the Essex Transport and Accessibility tool, which identifies specific trip rates for development based on the level of accessibility to those sites. It combines the industry standard TRIX tool, but with accessibility and location information. So we've used this to look at the potential demand of the local plans submission version developments, and then also added in an improvement factor to those sites to look at how trip rates could reduce with additional bus services and connectivity to the tube, the underground as well. That's where we get the 5% reduction that I referred to earlier. Peak spreading, yes, I take the gentleman's point about moving congestion into the neighbouring shoulders of the traditional peak hours. But if you read the report, we make reference to the precautionary approach that's been taken into the modelling overall, and how, if you compare it to temporary growth and how that would assume growth across the district based on the local plan submission version, we're actually testing considerably higher growth around there. The peak spreading assessment also provides an element of comfort over the fact that we have taken such a precautionary approach, that perhaps those traffic levels or a greater level of sustainable modal shift could take place, and provides a clearer picture perhaps on what the impact on the network would be. And it does demonstrate that there will still be areas of congestion, or what you would traditionally call congestion in a modelling sense, but not dissimilar or too far from what we're experiencing today or at current levels. I think I've raised a few of the points there.
Yeah, thanks for coming back on those points. On the sustainable transport, we really can't agree that there's any real detail on the measures. To us, it seems like a set of loose aspirations, talking about improving some bus routes and loosely improving cycle routes. But really, to deliver a plan of this scale, you need to know what you're going to do, not just talk broadly about what you might do. And also, I mean, you know, there is the admission that the town will still be congested to similar levels. I mean, you only have to go out there at lunchtime, and you can see that means a queue from one end of the town to the other for much of the day. And that is the similar level of congestion that exists at the moment. And, yeah, it will exist for longer. Thank you.
Mr. Lewin. Mr. Belton.
Thank you, Ma'am. I'll just make a few simple observations, that it may be that my colleague has some other points to make. But in reading the Transport Assessment Report, the key conclusion that sort of jumped out at me was that to mitigate the impact of transport of the local plan, they really do need to capitalise and expand on, as is defined here, the cycling, walking and public transport provision. And that's obviously quite important to the points we just heard on Epping. And we mentioned this morning that the TfL have announced that there's going to be a 25% improvement on capacity on the Central Line. In Paris 7.4.2 of the TAR on page 52, it confirms that that's the equivalent to an additional 12,000 customers per hour. So that's quite a significant improvement that's likely to be delivered. Now, our view is there is a lack of detail about how the sustainable transport enhancements are going to be delivered alongside the planned growth at Epping at the moment. But we would contend that the Council have missed an opportunity to really make the most of that planned improvement of the Central Line by not seeking to allocate growth within a short walking distance of the underground station. As we've put in our submissions to you already, you know, my client site is just a few minutes walk from the underground station. And as the TAR report acknowledges, that those sites which are located in such distance of key transport hubs are likely to generate less traffic. And in addition to that, we've put you in our hearing statement in paragraph 1.30 that the development of land east of Epping also brings with it an opportunity to deliver a relief road that will allow capacity improvements along some of the congested routes in Epping, particularly the High Street, which we've surmised in our submissions to you could lead to up to a 10% improvement. But that improvement has also been missed in the location of preferred growth to the south of the town.
Thank you. Mr. Stump.
Thank you. I would like to ask, particularly following the comments before and by Mr. Lewin earlier, I realise I'm probably the only unpaid person being here, not representing anybody in particular. and want to take this opportunity to ask the Council and its transport advisors why they haven't looked at any peak hour use of the part of the Central Line which is down as Epping-Ongar Railway. I asked last week, I think it was, about this to the Council and was told it was a problem of trains ending up at the south end of the line, not being able to get back up again, which I found a bit surprising at the time, because there are some passing loops. Then afterwards I thought, well, hang on a minute, London Underground managed to run that as a service for more than peak hours for quite some years. By way of background, for anyone who wasn't aware, that was a London Underground branch running between Epping, Northfield we've been discussing this morning with lots of employment growth, etc., and otherwise not very sustainable, and Ongar, reducing those poor commuters who have to try and now commute from those towns and further afield into Epping, causing problems for people in Epping, causing problems for themselves as well by controlled parking zones, pushing them further and further out of the town. Otherwise, they use car parks and top up by mobile phone wherever they work in central London during the day. And the answer that all the trains would end up at the south end doesn't convince, given that London Underground used to run a service. The reason they shut it was low passenger numbers. I understand the reason from that independently was there wasn't any checks at barriers whether you had a ticket or not. People didn't buy tickets, therefore the usage went down, therefore London Underground closed the service. In terms of sustainable transport, if we can't do something on walking and cycling, buses we might be able to improve, but generally aren't liked. There is an opportunity of reversing the demand for use of the car, which was from Northfield and Ongar, and providing another, perhaps peak hours only. If it's London commuters, that's probably mostly what you need. A service which will have a vast impact on a lot of residents in this district, in 3 towns. And I would like, please, an answer why that is not possible anymore, given there is a need for sustainable travel, in principle. The effects on the forest from emissions, the effects on the forest for redoing junctions like the Wake Arms, and even if you don't think about emissions from cars, just the general problems of being stuck in traffic for, as we hear, more hours to the same intensity doesn't appeal to a lot of people at all, has an impact on people's lives, when there would seem to be an obvious possibility, and we haven't heard why that's not possible.
Thank you. I'll ask the Council to come back on that in a minute. If we can just carry on around the table now. Mr Dagley.
Thank you, Madam. Yes, just picking up some of the points that have been made by others, but slightly different slant, I think. The document EB 503 is clearly pivotal to the approach, and it's only something that we've seen relatively recently, only came out in January, and it clearly informs the HRA, as Jacobs has explained. And so we feel some of the points we'd wish to make will be made perhaps later in the hearings under Matter 1, Issue 5. Given that there was a point made about land take, just to make the point that in the EB 1101A, which is the IDP, at least 8 of those junctions which required improvement, of which I think 5 were deemed essential, required land take from forest, and 2 of those from within the SAC. We've only just in the Appendix F of the EB 503 seen actually what that means for certainly one of those junctions. We had some highlight of another junction earlier. So that's obviously clearly a big issue for us. But I think on that point about mitigation, of course, under the Habitats Regulation Assessment, they can't be deemed mitigation measures. They're not mitigation. They might mitigate traffic for some other reason, but not for protection of the SAC. So in the Council's Matter 4 response on page 34 of their response to Matter 4 on paragraph 89, they refer to the fact that appropriate mitigation has been sorted. I think the first issue there is that it's not mitigation, certainly not for those junctions within the SAC, and nor are they appropriate in that they would physically damage the SAC and other junctions would physically damage the forest. And I think I echo some of the points that...
Sorry, Mr. Dagley, can you just make that? Can you just clarify that point? You're saying they're not mitigation in what sense?
In the sense that they would damage the SAC, that can't be taken as mitigation for, at least under the Habitats Regulation Assessment, under the Habitats Directive, Article 6.3. And as I say, I don't feel they're appropriate, given that they require physical damage to the SAC and also other areas of the forest. And I just, Madam, wanted to take up the point about the aspirational nature of do something scenario 5. I think it was particularly, which we've seen in the HRA. I understand there's now a DS6 and perhaps a DS7 on its way. But these are, we similarly concur that we feel these are aspirational. They're not fully in the control. It's something we want to revisit under Matter 1, Issue 5, if we may. There are other issues, and that leads to some uncertainty, I think, in deliverability. There are other uncertainties as well, I think, which we've heard today. On that same paragraph 89 on page 34 of the Council's Matter 4 response, the Council say that they're satisfied that there are no remaining uncertainties. That seems a puzzling statement to me, in that there's a clear uncertainty, given that what we've heard about the mitigation perhaps not being the aspirations of car use and so on, but more specifically, the HRA document EB 209, which again we haven't fully considered, does effectively countermand document EB 503, which we've just heard introduced, saying that those junctions can't be improved because of the SAC. So that leaves an uncertainty about, if they aren't changed, what happens to the congestion based on the local plan. The other issue that came up, and I know will be coming under your Matter 8, Madam, is under Matter 8, Issue 2.3, and I know you haven't read this yet, but of course the issue was referred to this morning about the uncertainty of the North-South corridor in Latton Priory. The fact that Essex County Council feel that's at the moment not easily deliverable. I'm not quite sure exactly the words that they've used, but that also gives us some concern, because clearly there's potential for traffic to come down which may not otherwise use a sustainable transport corridor within Harlow. And that may come down the corridor of the 1393 to the Wake Arms roundabout. I think they're the key points on mitigation and uncertainty. I think just on that uncertainty, there's an issue about sustainability also in EB 503 paragraph 9.4.1. It does say, and this echoes this iterative approach that Essex have taken, it echoes an earlier document, EB 500E, on page 3 of that document, that additional mitigation or more substantial schemes may be required at those roundabouts, the Wake Arms roundabout and indeed the Robin Hood roundabout, which is a couple of miles to the south. That suggests to me that, firstly, if they were built, there would be an uncertainty in the future as to protection of the SAC. But given that the HRA is saying they shouldn't be built, that then throws into considerable uncertainty in my mind how these junctions staying the same will then cope with the local plan developments. Again, one of the issues we want to explore further, and one of the reasons we want to explore further, there's a lot of depth and detail in EB 503, and queuing in particular. What I've seen of it doesn't seem to be, the queues seem to be optimistic. Queuing, it's a model obviously I don't fully understand and will need to have a look at in the future, if I may, Madam. And I think the final point, which is a really important point, which again, because it's come up in Matter 4, but it's something we'd want to deal with under Matter 1, is on page 105, page 105, sorry, beg your pardon, page 38, Madam, paragraph 105 of the Council's Matter 4 response. They talk about project level, and that the roundabouts can be dealt with project level HRAs, Habitat Regulation Assessments. That is not the correct way to deal with protection of the SAC under the Habitats Directive. They need to be appropriate assessments, which is a level more detailed than an HRA, and they need to be strategic. Project level one by one is not sufficient, and again leads to further uncertainty about how the traffic and how these things will be dealt with in the future. Thank you.
Before we lose what Mr. Dagley said, did the council want to make any kind of response now? But obviously, we have some time when we do the matter 1, issue 5 statements. If you could make sure that your statement clearly identifies those junctions of concern and addresses them specifically, that would be helpful. Thank you. Did you want to make any response at this stage?
We will obviously come back with further details, and I think just by way of some background which might be helpful, within the Transport Assessment Report, Appendix E, Scenario 3, shows the local plan up to 2033 and tests it with no physical highway improvements. I think in terms of the wider discussion, we're obviously very aware of this and need to come back to it, but I think it's also important that we have the discussion with Natural England present and all other relevant factors. So I'm not really in a position necessarily to go into detail today.
Thank you, Mr. Dagley. Mr. Asprey.
Yes, ma'am. We start from the premise that there is no alternative to achieving significant modal shift in future. We cannot go on relying to the extent that we are on the private motor car. And in this sense, the local plan it seems to me, is curiously dated. And it lacks ambition and it's missed an opportunity. And the opportunity we clearly talk about is something that districts outside London in the Greater South East would be envious of, which is the availability of the Central Line. And this goes back to the fundamental land use strategy. If you go for a land use strategy like the council has gone for, which is a dispersed land use strategy, you lose the opportunity to exploit high density, high volume public transport systems like the underground. And you build in a propensity to use the private motor car. So there is the fundamental problem is that the land use strategy, a flawed land use strategy, drives the inability to achieve significant modal shift. And it seems to us that the transport policy almost seems to have followed on from the land use strategy, whereas, just as with the settlement hierarchy that we discussed earlier, if you start with a vision, however ambitious that is, if you start with a vision to achieve significant modal shift, that should inform your land use strategy. And it hasn't, it patently hasn't in this case. And there is a golden opportunity missed specifically in relation to the Central Line, and there may be opportunities to extend the Central Line, not necessarily just by heavy rail options, but also you have in Cambridgeshire the guided bus system and things like that. There are opportunities to bring in settlements like North Weald Bassett into a higher density. But if you disperse your development, you lose the opportunity to achieve particularly development-funded public transport improvements. You know, if you have significant concentrations of development starting in the most sustainable locations, but also at a level that exploits the opportunity to achieve significant public transport benefits, then that can be done by concentration. It's the policy that the council is pursuing at Harlow, but seems to have eschewed in the rest of the district.
Mr. Hill.
Thank you, ma'am. I thank Mr. Jones for his explanation of the significance of the TAR. That was helpful, I must say, to me, and thank you for asking the question in the way that you did, ma'am. As we understand it, then, the assumption there is a 5% reduction in car mode share and a concomitant increase in non-car mode share. And, of course, the various mode shares are set out in the TAR, page 12, table 4.1. So, for example, in terms of non-car mode shares, we've got within Epping Forest, and I understand this table relates to Epping Forest, 0.6% cycle use as opposed to East of England 2.4%, pedestrian 4.1% as opposed to East of England 6.8%, as an example. So it's the Epping Forest figures for mode share that we're using as the baseline. I think that's right. the point I would like to make, ma'am, is simply this. In relation to the Garden Town sites at Harlow, these sites, of course, are lying immediately adjacent to Harlow Town, which was deliberately laid out with a very extensive, dedicated network of cycleways and footways right across the town, integral to the design of the town. And the advantage of the Garden Town sites is, of course, that they can plug into the networks that are already there, that you will probably have seen yourself on the ground. So the potential for increasing the non-car mode share must be greater adjoining Harlow Town, where those networks are already in place. I think a similar point would also apply to the bus network, which is already well developed within Harlow Town, far more so than in many rural parts of Epping Forest. So again, the potential for increasing the public transport mode share must be greater when one's looking at a site adjoining Harlow Town, and far more so than in more remote parts of the district. Thank you, ma'am.
Ms. Riddle.
Thank you. There's obviously been some discussion about the improvement in the capacity of the central line, but I think it's worth saying, and I'm sure my colleague will have something more to say about it, there's still a significant concern on the behalf of my client about the capacity of the central line and the location of development in that context. Strategically, we consider that there will need to be this modal shift in order to sustainably deliver growth, but there is a lack of detail at present in the plan as to how that will be achieved and how the sustainable growth can be achieved in the area on that basis. The evidence and the information that we've submitted has shown how there's been a reduction, for example, in the past in bus routes in the area around Loughton, and it's of concern, ongoing concern to the town council as to what is going to change in the future that means that bus routes can be implemented and will deliver the sustainable transport modes that need to be achieved to support the growth. We've also highlighted points about concerns about improvements to specific junctions, some of which have already been mentioned today, and those remain of concern to the Town Council. And we've also highlighted that in Loughton there are 12 infrastructure improvements needed, identified as being needed in the plan period, to be funded jointly between Essex County Council and developers. But the timing and achievement of these improvements still present uncertainty and concern in the plan.
Thank you. Mr. Pond.
Thank you, ma'am. First of all, may I say I agree 100% with Dr. Dagley in that transport improvements for highway upgrades to the roundabout simply cannot be achieved without great damage to the special area of conservation. And both of the major ones that Dr. Dagley talked about are in the parish of Loughton. Secondly, may I just refer to paper EB 503, which is the transport assessment, which we have not had time yet fully to evaluate, but on which we hope to provide a statement for you in relation to matter 15 when it comes up, and also, as Dr. Dagley says, to the reserve matter on matter 1, issue 5. But I do want to take issue with the transport assessment report at paragraph 7.4.2, which talks about a 25% uplift in the capacity of the central line. What the EB 503 paper does not state is that that upgrade and uplift cannot be achieved until the very end of the plan period. The only date mentioned in that paragraph is 2023, but that relates solely to the Piccadilly line, which does not affect Epping Forest. Therefore, madam, my contention is that paragraph 742 of paper EB 503 is misleading. The other points that I think on tables in EB 503 ought to be pointed out to you there are a number of errors in the tables which give the frequency of bus services, certainly within my town. As my colleague here has said, in recent years and months there have been reductions in bus service. We are not, we being Epping Forest District Council, or indeed the County Council, are not in a position to be able to assure improvements or restitutions of what has been taken away, because that is within the gift of Transport for London. And the last point I would like to make is that although I share to some extent Mr. Stamp's views on the corridor of the former Great Eastern Railway between Epping and Ongar, I believe the difficulty is the interchange at Ongar. The formation was protected by a special policy in the 1998 adopted local plan, but unfortunately the infrastructure is now such that it would be almost impossible to use that line as an extension of the central line for commuter purposes. Thank you, ma'am.
Perhaps if you could first just address the points about the Epping-Ongar line, and then if we come on to just discuss and clarify the situation around the additional capacity we've been talking about at the central line, both in relation to what's been said here and earlier, where it was being suggested it should be used to support more growth in certain areas. That would be helpful. If you start with Mr. Stamp's point.
Thank you, Madam. Yes, in terms of the Epping to Ongar line, the Council is obviously very aware that it potentially presents an opportunity, and we have been in discussions with Essex County Council, who are equally keen to investigate the potential use of that line. However, from early feasibility work undertaken in-house, we've concluded that the line is very constrained. It goes through sites of special scientific interest, and it provides limited passing opportunities, which we feel means it would be very limited and most likely not be able to provide the frequency of service that would be required to stimulate change. Importantly, also, the line is in private ownership, and we're certainly, from our early discussions with the landowner, we don't feel that it's deliverable at this stage, or available, rather, I should say. If I could just expand on that slightly, I think it'd be useful to also explain some of the other discussions we've been having with Essex County Council around promoting the use of sustainable travel modes, particularly around Epping and North Weald. This, again, will be covered in the summary update note, which will be available to participants and yourselves, I hope, in the next few days. We're just waiting sign-off between the District Council and the County Council. But within this, we're proposing a number of additions to the local plan submission version to provide more specific requirements, particularly in relation to, in Epping, the need to ensure the provision of safe and convenient routes to key destinations from the South Epping master plan area, including to the London Underground station, and ensure that viable alternatives to private car use will be available in order to prevent the establishment of unsustainable travel behaviour. I won't go through it in detail, that will be with you in due course, but we think it's very important to strengthen those.
Thank you. On that point, if you're proposing modifications, do the remaining sessions provide an opportunity to discuss those? I mean, how will that become available for people to look at and comment upon?
Certainly. These relate to the P policies, I think, predominantly. So my assumption is they would be most appropriately considered through those, for the matters, for those which do come towards the end. And as I've said, that will be available in the very near future. So I think there'll be an opportunity for everybody to see that and comment on it in good time. If I could just sort of also address the wider points raised by Mr. Stamp and others around the fact that the plan isn't aspirational in terms of what it's doing for sustainable transport. I would disagree with that, because I think particularly with the proposed changes that we're going to put forward for Epping and North Weald, but more importantly for the work on the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town, I think there's considerable aspirations there to promote very innovative solutions, so particularly the sustainable transport corridor that will run north, south, east, west across Harlow and Gilston Garden Town, connecting the new communities. And within that, there's many associated improvements, which I know we'll come on to in the Matter 8 session. I would like to highlight that there is a sustainable transport corridor study which does look at the feasibility of that and provides indicative routes for the corridor and just generally demonstrating the overall feasibility of the project. There's also a draft transport strategy which has been produced. The Sustainable Transport Corridor Study is EB 1407A. I realise we'll be coming back to that. And also the draft transport strategy for the Garden Town is EB 1408. There is also a dedicated work stream across the Garden Town looking specifically about the delivery of sustainable transport infrastructure and improvements. So I realise we'll be coming back to that, but I think it's important to stress, and this is set out in more detail in our Matter 8 statement. Just also in terms of the infrastructure delivery plan, there are a number of public transport measures set out within there. I won't list them, but just to say that there are a number of items around public transport improvements in there. In terms of the capacity of the central line, I think we heard earlier from my colleague, Ms Blom-Cooper, that the Regulation 20 representation from TfL does indicate that there is sufficient capacity on the central line to accommodate planned growth in the plan. TfL's analysis indicates that the increased level of patronage associated with growth in the district can be accommodated within the identified capacity, and this is not expected to change considerably up to 2041. As I think you heard as well earlier, this is linked in part to the Elizabeth line and other capacity improvements. I don't know if there's anything further to add on that, or
no. Sorry. Is from TfL is also the impact of Crossrail, the Elizabeth line opening up later this year, with the potential for 10% increase in capacity across London's lines as well.
So just coming back to the arguments that were being made earlier, has anything changed in relation to the capacity of the central line since the TfL Reg 20 reps were made? So they made their comment on the basis of what was in the plan, and has growth in certain locations such as Chigwell that we were hearing about earlier, places that are close by to the central line, and Epping East, as we've heard, have any restrictions been placed on growth in any certain settlements because of the capacity of the central line that shouldn't have been?
As I understand it, there have been concerns throughout the preparation of the plan in terms of capacity, but obviously we've been working closely with TfL and Essex County Council in order to understand those. So the constraints or otherwise have been factored into the plan making process, and obviously that's been factored into the final local plan submission version. But we've been mindful of obviously the position that's set out now.
If I could just add, Chigwell is actually on the loop line, which is not the main line, and doesn't have the same frequency of trains on it as the Epping into central London line.
So when we're hearing from people like Mr. Asprey at the back that that the council hasn't taken full advantage of the capacity of the central line to drive modal shift, that's not a choice that the council's taken because of concerns about capacity on the central line? It's not that you'd have put more development there if you'd have known there was more capacity available.
As I understand it, there is no more capacity on the loop line. There is the additional capacity is on the main line into central London. And by capacity, I mean frequency of service.
Okay, so just to ask my sort of simple question again, when people like Mr. Asprey have been concerned that full advantage hasn't been taken, it isn't, whatever your decisions surrounding the distribution of development, they haven't been constrained in certain locations by concern about capacity on the central line that actually isn't there?
No.
Thank you. Mr. Pond.
I may come back on that. I'm glad Ms. Blom-Cooper corrected herself, because it's patently not, what she said first, patently not true. If there is doubt about this, might I, through you, Madam, ask that the Council ask TfL to give, in time for the Matter 15 examination, a clear statement of when the extra capacity through new trains on the Central Line is likely to be achieved.
For what reason would you want that information?
Madam, in order to ascertain when the phasing of development near the Central Line will become feasible and possible, and whether it's in the planned period.
Do you have the opposite concern of someone like Mr. Asprey? Are you concerned that there's not enough capacity to support planned
Indeed,
growth?
I do, Madam, and the Town Council will, in respect of Matter 15, in our statement on that, be providing you with evidence on loadings.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Just picking up the points that have been made about the timing of the major improvements that are planned to the Central Line. We've reviewed TfL's Deep Tube Upgrade Programme, which was prepared in May 2016 by their Programme and Investment Committee, and it states that the improvements are planned to be delivered between 2025 and 2033, and therefore will be delivered within the plan period. We think that's a really important point to be made. And also picking up on the point about the impact of Crossrail, we've reviewed the Crossrail business case, which makes the statement that the extra capacity provided would reduce congestion on existing underground lines, including the Central Line. Figure E from the business case shows levels of tube crowding at 2026 following the implementation of Crossrail, which predicts that most sections of the Central Line would experience between 10% and 30% reduction in crowding. It's already been rehearsed that as a result TfL have concluded that Central Line capacity shouldn't act as a deterrent to the planned growth in the draft local plan, and that's reiterated in the TAR report. And therefore our conclusion is therefore the draft local plan misses the opportunity to provide development at the most sustainable locations, and in terms of the site at East Epping, with a 5-minute walk from the underground station and a 10-minute walk from the high street and the facilities and services there, we very much feel that the current local plan draft misses that opportunity.
Thank you. We'll hear from Mr. Asprey and Mr. Hollingworth, and then I think we'll have a short break before moving on to the sort of the IDP aspects of infrastructure. So, Mr. Asprey, please.
Yes, most of my points have just been made, actually, and in terms of programming to the improvements of the Central Line. But I think the only other point I would make is that to have a significant impact over and above the reduction in capacity, the reduction in crowding on the Central Line, one would have to be talking about thousands of new houses in these locations, and we're not talking about that. We're talking about 4,000 houses in Epping at the moment. We would like to see more, but that's spread amongst a number of locations. So we're not proposing, nobody is proposing, to introduce 10,000 houses or something like that level next to an underground station. So to have a significant impact, particularly in central London, and particularly taking account of the additional capacity that Crossrail will provide. And as I said, Mum, in terms of Chigwell, we are 5 miles from Crossrail Ilford. We are not talking about levels of development that would have a significant adverse impact if they were redistributed on the capacity of the Central Line.
Thank you, Mum. Just 2 brief points, if I may. Firstly, just wish to highlight that at EB410A, which is the Housing Implementation Strategy 2019, paragraph 21 lists the 3 constraints the council consider there to be which prevent it from meeting housing needs within the first 5 years of the plan period. One of which is the capacity of the transport network. So clearly the council do consider that to be a constraint on growth. And secondly, Mom, just wanted to emphasise the point that not all opportunities to direct growth to locations from which there might be sustainable modes of transport or opportunities to make use of those are reliant on significant infrastructure upgrades, and we do obviously there are existing railway stations within and in close proximity to the district. As we discussed this morning, haven't had any real growth directed to them. Thank you.
Thank you. Did the council want to come back on any of those last points that have been made before we take a break? No. Okay. Thank you. I think if I just have a look at my questions for the next session in case you need to look at them. I want to just turn and get a little bit of clarity on the IDP and the certainty or the confidence we can have in the delivery of particularly some of the essential items of infrastructure where there are funding gaps. And also, I'll just ask you a quick question because it only occurred to me when I was last looking at the IDP, just for some clarity. You can have a quick check for me. I'll just close down now. It's the IDP, the main report, figure 3 on page 15. There's a table there showing the housing units on allocated sites that I assume the IDP has tested. I just wondered if it was accurate. The figures don't look right to me. Either that or I'm not understanding it. So perhaps if you can just come back to me on that basic point. We'll have a break should we take a break until 4:15? Thank you. Last set of questions of the day, really, concerning the findings of the infrastructure delivery plan and the TAR in relation to transport and also other infrastructure. And I really just want to ask questions about the confidence that there is that these will be delivered in time, and particularly in light of some of the funding gaps that have been highlighted. First of all, though, I just asked a question before the break about the IDP figure 3, table 15, and the quantity of development that have been tested in each settlement. Can you just clarify that for me? Thank you.
Yes, madam. It's a typographical error, so we've worked out that some of the rows have slipped down one in the figures, and the housing units column. So the numbers, it should be correct, it's just they've just slipped down by one.
So the IDP has tested the quantity that's allocated in the plan?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so sort of rolling up my third and then fifth and sixth bullet points, if you like, just to ask a general question to get started. So the infrastructure schedule that accompanies the infrastructure delivery plan, which is EB 1101B, that identifies a number of items of infrastructure for the different areas of the district, including a number of items of essential transport and other infrastructure, including health and education, perhaps. And in some of those cases, funding gaps are either known to be fairly substantial or are unknown. And so I was just wondering if you could talk through that and explain how much confidence we can have that those will be delivered as required. We'll start with that.
Thank you, Madam.
Thank you.
So in general terms, absolutely, the IDP sets out the range of mitigation measures which are required. And these are classified, as you've said, as being critical, essential and desirable, and there is an indicative cost where, as far as possible. Where there are funding gaps, these are identified as far as possible. Sorry, and certainly in terms of from a plan making perspective, the Council is very confident that the necessary infrastructure can be delivered to support growth as required. In accordance with our hearing statement, the IDP and the schedule, as you've referred to, so the EB 1101A and EB 1101B, demonstrate that the infrastructure can be delivered. In addition, the schedule itself, EB 1101B, pulls together the outputs and infrastructure requirements. Clearly, that's intended to be a live schedule and provokes an effective mechanism for documenting any changes coming forward. We have identified a range of funding sources available to support infrastructure delivery over the plan period. These include sources from governmental and non-departmental public bodies, partnerships and wider grant opportunities. As you would expect, alongside these sources, developer funding will be an important element of delivering the infrastructure required to support growth. Building on the IDP itself, in October 2018, the Council produced what we've termed an infrastructure delivery topic paper. That's EB 1101C. And the purpose of that paper is to provide greater information and provide greater certainty on infrastructure delivery, very much aimed at identifying that recognising that there are funding gaps and giving comfort to what the Council has done and is doing to address those and to show deliverability of the key infrastructure. So the topic paper includes a high-level framework for developer contributions, which includes apportionment and pooling. It takes into account the SIL regulations in terms of the pooling restrictions, as they have been. We're also producing addenda to the topic paper, which are largely complete, which are very much around supporting the development management stage and providing further site-specific details on delivery and funding apportionment for the key infrastructure projects. They specifically relate to education, highway mitigation and sports facilities, and they will be available in the near future. The topic paper also provides more information on external funding sources that are outlined in the IDP itself, including work that's ongoing to progress and secure funding sources, and also identifies any risks of funding not being in place and the contingency measures that are in place to deal with that, should it be required. So further work is being undertaken, to understand funding sources. And as you will appreciate, it's an iterative process. The situation changes over time. But we're very confident that from a plan-making perspective, the IDP, together with the associated documentation, provides the necessary confidence in terms of delivery that you need.
Thank you. Could you just say a little bit more about where there is a reliance or a need for developer contributions, and perhaps the extent that developers have been involved in any of the work that you're doing around the topic paper and the addenda to that, and also how any contributions required from development has been factored into any viability testing to date?
Certainly. In terms of your first question, the IDP itself has obviously gone through a long process. There was an initial IDP in 2017 or 2016, which was alongside the draft local plan, and obviously that was published at that stage for consultation. We've taken forward ARUP on behalf of the council have taken forward and produced the final IDP that has included engagement with key stakeholders, including developers, at various stages. The topic paper itself and the addenda are building upon what's already in the IDP. So the consultation for those has largely been with Essex County Council in terms of the highways work and the education work, and with Sport England in terms of the sports provision requirements. And I should say this is something that the council has very much taken on off our own back in order to give certainty for delivery as we move to the application stage. It's not something that's been sort of imposed on us from Essex County Council or from Sport England, so as such. In terms of the way the viability work has considered the developer contribution requirements, I know we're going to come on and talk more about viability on another day, and we'll have our consultant here on another day. But the local plan viability study, which is EB 301, has taken assumptions on the level of developer contributions that will be required for different types of sites. So it doesn't go into site-specific detail, but it talks, it applies appropriate assumptions. I can give you references to where in the report. It's specifically on pages 45 and 46, where it talks about the assumptions that have been taken that have enabled the modelling to conclude that the requirements will overall be viable. What I should say as well is that the IDP topic paperwork and the addenda are focused on the rest of the district as opposed to the Garden Town. So the IDP topic paperwork looks at the settlements across the district. The IDP itself looks at settlements at a settlement level. The purpose of the topic paper and the addenda is to help to break that down into a more site-specific level. The Harlow and Gilston Garden Town IDP and viability study is also being produced, which is providing greater detail on the requirements for the Garden Town itself. And as you know, that work is currently being completed and will provide supplementary detail, again, very much aimed at the planning application and delivery stage as opposed to the plan-making stage. Through that process, there is ongoing engagement with the key promoters. We have actually a series of one-to-one meetings coming up next week, or perhaps the week after, if I've lost track, but to take all the developers of the Garden Town sites through the findings and allow them to input into it. And the work on the viability study is running concurrently with the IDP. But as I said, that's very much above and beyond what we feel is required for the local plan, and is factoring in the fact that the growth on the Garden Town is across three different district areas and goes beyond our local plan period.
Okay, So in terms of the where the IDP schedule is relying on, to an extent, on developer contributions, there's an understanding from the viability study of what that level would be. It's not sort of an undisclosed amount that will suddenly cause viability problems down the line.
No, I mean, clearly the contributions are going to be different for different areas of the district, for different sites, depending on the exact requirements, some of which will come through the further work we're doing. But the the viability study has taken an assumed figure in terms of developer contributions on a site-by-site basis, and plug those into the model, and those assumptions are informed by the work that has been undertaken as part of the IDP itself. So there's a direct linkage there through, and just by way of example, it talks about in paragraph of the viability study, paragraph 2.10.5, infrastructure costs of £32,000 per dwelling at the upper end, with the lower range also being considered. So I'm probably not best placed to tell you the detail of how that's been worked through. I'm sure we can ask our viability consultants to explain further, but the report does explain those assumptions.
And having looked at all of that and taken it into account, is the council, does anything stand out as being less confident or less certain of delivery about it? Are there any outstanding concerns that the council has?
There are some very big infrastructure items, as you would expect. The majority of those are related to the Garden Town itself, less so across the rest of the district. But I think the biggest single item is the sustainable transport corridors, which will require funding from across the Garden Town sites, including Gilston in East Hertfordshire. And that's one of the most significant elements that the Garden Town partner authorities are grappling with, because we are aware that there will be a funding gap, albeit that the emerging work coming through the Garden Town viability study is very encouraging. And obviously I don't have the findings to share with you today, but the findings are indicating that that the viability of the sites, taking into account all the requirements, will be positive. But there will be a reliance on external funding sources particularly to deliver the sustainable transport corridor in its entirety. Some of that is linked in with a HIF bid as well, which is being put together by Hertfordshire County Council in partnership with Essex County Council. And the HIF bid is focused primarily on Gilston and on front load, on pump priming, sorry, that's the word, pump priming some of the key infrastructure that's required in Gilston. But that has an effect of recycling money across the Garden Town. It's complicated, but will help to promote the viability of the sustainable transport corridors, because it will front load the funding for other key infrastructure at Gilston. So the key infrastructure across the Garden Town has to be seen in the context of the whole Garden Town project, and taking proportionate contributions from sites within different administrative areas. So the details of that are advanced and will be set out in the IDP, which, as we've said, will be available in the near future.
And might that process, you're talking about seeing it in that wider context, might that address some of the concerns that might have been expressed around the fact that the Garden Towns are expected to start delivering fairly early on? So if you've got delivery where you've got a funding gap and you're expecting delivery quite early, then obviously that could be a concern.
It's a concern that we recognise, in the sense that we understand that contributions will be phased towards the sustainable transport corridor over the planned period. Within the statement I referred to earlier that we're concluding with Essex County Council at the moment, that sets out an agreed position in terms of when we what we feel is required and by when, by way of those key interventions. it's acknowledged that the sustainable transport corridor will not be in place early in the plan period. It will be phased to deliver throughout the plan period, but it's also acknowledged that it must be in place before the end of the plan period. The key issue, as far as we're concerned, is that there needs to be enough sustainable transport measures in place upon occupation of the first development sites within the Garden Town to ensure that to encourage the use of non-cars modes of transport, if that makes sense. So to make sure that people have enough alternatives available to them to prevent unsustainable travel behaviour taking place. So I think there's a recognition that there will be measures in place. There will need to be measures in place early on, but they will need to be viable and they will need to be proportionate in terms of how and when they come forward.
Thank you. Anyone else? Inglis.
Thank you. I've got two concerns that I want to raise with respect to the IDP, and that's with respect to the missing evidence base that's still not available. One is with respect to air quality evidence, and then the other one is with respect to the mitigation of recreational impacts on the SAC. So starting with air quality, we have advised from our Reg 20 submissions that the air quality evidence has been missing, and in that extent it's still missing with respect to the impact of congestion, and we've just heard that congestion is likely to continue in Epping Town outside of the SAC itself. So with congestion likely to continue and or potentially get worse, and with no air quality mitigation or evidence base, we have no understanding of the mitigation that's proposed to any AQMAs, or if there's a likely requirement for additional AQMAs in the district, and how the council are proposing to address that. And in that respect, it's therefore not been identified in the deliverability or viability of sites from the allocation, with the allocations. And then with respect to the mitigation of the recreational impacts on Epping Forest, we've now seen an interim mitigation strategy that only comprises of SAMS measures. These SAMS measures haven't yet been included to the full extent in the IDP yet, as the interim mitigation strategy came out after the IDP. And I note that the Conservatives still have some concerns with respect to the costing of those SAMS measures, and that further work is therefore required with respect to SAMS. So we don't know the full extent necessarily of SAMS payments that would be required from development in the district. And then further to that, Section 10 of the IDP, with respect to green infrastructure, mentions that development will require a meaningful proportion of SANGs. There's no understanding of what meaning proportion is. There's no evidence base. There's no green infrastructure strategy that goes along with that statement. To that extent, our hearing statement, which we submitted last week for matters 5, 6 and 16, appends an email that we sent to the policy officers at council last year asking what quantum meaningful proportion is, and we got advised that it was identified on a site-by-site basis, and that they couldn't define what meaningful proportion was. So in that respect, we don't consider that the council understands or has a full green infrastructure strategy to support the delivery of SANGs, where they've identified that on the Garden Town communities and for the South Epping allocation. In addition to that, whilst the Garden Town allocations also identify a meaning proportion of SANGs in their allocation specifically, the South Epping allocation does not. And therefore, we question how this could be effective without the development of a green infrastructure strategy.
Mr. Lewin.
Just really in terms of whether or not all the infrastructure's been identified. I mean, I think it clearly hasn't yet, so the council can't determine whether or not it can be delivered or financially viable. And I think, particularly in terms of sustainable transport, that's a point shared by Essex County Council. And secondly, where it is identified, for instance, highway improvements, they haven't yet identified whether or not that can be delivered because it requires forest land, and still more work is required there. Will you be dealing with Epping Station capacity next, or Epping the central line, sorry.
I thought we'd discussed that.
Well, just a couple of points to make on, because it is a further point down here, is there are proposals for Epping Station. It's one of the sites in the local plan. It's unclear whether or not they'll be retaining the car park into the station when they develop that site, and we really need clarification on that. And secondly, whether or not that site will improve access to the station, particularly in terms of DDA compliant access.
Thank you. Mr. Koski.
Thank you, Ma'am. Just a few points. I've submitted my case in evidence that you've drawn attention to. Some very comforting words from Mr. Coleman about the Harlow and Gilston Garden Community IDP being in production, on its way. Obviously, this work has largely already been undertaken by Atkins. I know it's not part of this evidence base, but it's part of the evidence base of Harlow, and it's in the public domain. It's easily accessible. I have shared a link with the programme officer. If you don't have it before you, Ma'am, I would just draw your attention to Appendix B of that document, which makes for interesting reading, bearing in mind that this document was produced just a few months before the submission of the plan. But the Atkins report has a very handy executive summary, and it outlines that for the strategic sites outside of Harlow, the remaining funding gap, the residual funding gap, is 154 million. The gross funding gap is actually 667 million, which is on page 139 of that document. But through developer contributions and other creative measures, the funding gap is reduced to 154 million across all the sites that comprise the outside of Harlow. Now, they used a sill rate of £87.50 per square metre and a levy of about 7,500 per dwelling, which they didn't consider to be viable for dwellings in Harlow itself, but potentially viable for those communities on the outskirts of Harlow. But they worked that model on the basis of 30% affordable housing. They couldn't test viability because in Appendix B there's schedules of all the infrastructure, and there's a common theme running through all of these tables, that you have the funding source is unidentified, committed funding, 0 in nearly every column, expected funding, the developer contributions based on 30% affordable housing, estimated developer contribution to be confirmed, and the reason being is that Atkins could not test any viability because there was no viability information available from any of the promoters of the major sites. And then if you throw into the mix the likelihood that the Princess Alexandra Hospital will relocate into one of those communities, most likely Gilston, it will have ramifications in terms of how the infrastructure deficit is pooled around all of the garden community. So this work has largely been done, and I'm sure the council are aware of the work, as is in the public domain. And I think that my question to the council would be, given that this report is less than a year old, has tested scenarios based on 30% affordable housing.
Which report is this again?
This is the Atkins report, the final report, March 2018. I've shared a link with the programme officer. It's identified as HEB I1 in the Harlow evidence base, and it is in the public domain. And I have made it available to this examination. It's a very large document, so it's best to share a link. But I draw your attention particularly to page 158, Appendix B, which is pretty self-explanatory, and it takes forward in a lot more detail the useful executive summary, which I've copied into my evidence. But this, I'd emphasise, this report was only a few months old when the plan was submitted. I think my question to the council would be, what has materially changed? What funding sources? Because the Atkins report also identifies creative ways of bridging the gap. It talks about prudential borrowing by the public sector, local government, bonds, institutional finance. That's all well and good, but this plan relies on certainty. It relies on a trajectory that has a prescription, dwellings delivered by a certain date to make it work. And yet there's acknowledged funding gaps in a piece of work that hasn't been undertaken by Epping Forest at the moment, but does exist largely in the same form on the Harlow website as part of their evidence base.
And taking that, so if you're right, what are the consequences of that, and what should happen to the plan?
Well, this report is specific to the Harlow Garden community. So, as I said earlier, what it means is that these dwellings will be delivered on a slower trajectory because there'll be infrastructure deficit and the unlocking of sites will take longer. Therefore, the spatial strategy needs to respond to that. So essentially, the more plural the spatial strategy, the more full spectrum, the more likely the dwellings will be delivered. And I think it's pretty obvious that the kind of scale of growth envisaged at Harlow, which could be 16,100, it could be 17,100, who knows, because there's no density prescription that's been adopted as yet. But it's obviously going to be upwards of 16,100 dwellings. It's not going to take place in the plan period. It's going to sort of cross into a different plan period, and it should be seen for what it is. We have no issue on the allocation of the sites themselves, just the fact that the council rely upon them to deliver on a given date, at a given point in time, at a given rate, consistently, with acknowledged funding gaps of £150 million. So until there is sort of very tangible evidence that that funding gap has been bridged, that public finance is available, and I brought forward an allocation in East Herts, north of Ware. So I speak to the County Council all the time as we take that forward. And they're very honest that they've made bids for finance, but it's very early days. There's no guarantee of that bid being successful, or if it is, what level of finance will actually be delivered. And then it will go back to the developers to up their contributions, and then you'll start to hit viability issues. I personally think £32,000 per dwelling in the Harlow area is going to be pretty excessive if you look at the indices of house prices relative to Harlow and its surrounding areas, which is very stratified. There's not one single sort of average house price for the Harlow area. It varies considerably. So in conclusion, I have no confidence in the fact that the IDP is confident that there will be no issues and that all these strategic sites will deliver as and when they're requested to. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll hear from Mr. Hill, and then perhaps the council could address those points.
Thank you, ma'am. I've got 3 short points. First of all, we understand what Mr. Coleman has said, and we appreciate the issues associated with coordinating as between 3 local planning authorities and 2 county councils, especially in relation to the Gilston proposals and East Herts. Ma'am, I don't know how familiar you are with those, but they lie across the railway line and across the Stork Valley from the existing settlement of Harlow. Second, we note the council's position as it evolves, and we note also the documents that are imminently to be made available to you and to us in relation to the Garden Town IDP and viability study. And third, ma'am, in the light of that, we would like to defer our detailed comments on this to matter 8, which is your specific consideration of the Garden Town communities. I don't think we can take this much further forward today in the light of what's been said.
Mr. Coleman.
Thank you, Madam. The main issue I wanted to raise in response to Mr. Koski was the Atkins report he was referring to is part of Harlow's evidence base for their local plan. It's essentially their infrastructure delivery plan, which was produced at the same time alongside the production of the IDP for the Epping Forest local plan. The consultants, Arup and Atkins, did work together, and we actually initiated a collaboration agreement, which is one of the ED, I forget the reference number, but it's one of the ED documents, to make sure that information was shared and to try and ensure consistency. But we didn't have ability to sign off or comment in detail on the Atkins work. So I don't recognise I recognise the numbers that are being quoted, but I don't agree with them. And I think what's set out in the IDP to support this local plan is far more relevant and will be supplemented by the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town IDP and viability study that's coming forward. So totally appreciate there are funding gaps, as you would expect with a plan of this nature. And we don't have all the answers at this stage as to how they will all be plugged, as you would expect. But I think there's enough certainty and clarity on what the council is doing in partnership with other councils to bring forward funding, bearing in mind that these are long-term plans and the infrastructure is strategic and long-term in nature. The shorter-term infrastructure requirements are deliverable, and the funding gaps are either less or non-existent. Sorry, Madam, the ED document I referred to, I'm not sure if it's actually on the evidence base, sorry, I'm not sure if it's on the website yet, but if it isn't, it will be very shortly.
Mr. Dagley.
Thank you, Madam. Just want to add 2 points. I welcome Mr. Coleman's point about the north-south sustainable corridor in Harlow. We made a point in our response to the submission version of the plan in our paragraph of our letter 11.2.2. The point made by Mr. Coleman is that he's cognizant of the fact that if there's not something in place, people may well already adopt other more car-based responses, and then to learn the new sustainable approach to transport may be quite difficult. And that something would be put in place to make sure that at least there was something there. But I think obviously there's some concern about that. And the point that we made in our representation, which is slightly different, is that there will be a lag time in uptake. Almost certainly it's a change in behaviour, that modal shift that we're expecting. So we would expect a lag time. And the other important issue is that there's talk in the IDP of a safeguarded route from Latin Priory to the Junction 7. And we make the point that if that safeguarded route is built first, before the north-south corridor is sorted out, then people are going to use that readily, and then to relearn and use the north-south corridor is going to be all the more difficult. So any gap, any lag time in the funding, let alone lag time in people's behaviour, will be a serious concern, I think. The other point that was raised by a separate party at the Telelands on the SANGs, we were going to bring that forward under both Matter 8, Issue 1, in relation to the garden towns, and also under DM2. But we have made the point a number of times that SANGs tariff and funding for strategic SANGs is really most important, and that project level or site-by-site based one may not be adequate. And I understand with the garden town approach at the moment that there is potential room for SANGs at Latin Priory, which was referred to earlier, but maybe not at other sites, and that gives us cause for concern. Thank you.
Did the council just want to address the points about SANGs and SAMs as raised by Mr. Dagley and Ms. Inglis earlier on?
Just briefly, Madam, I think we would agree that this should be considered at later sessions in detail, and particularly when Natural England are here. But there is an interim recreational strategy in place, as I'm sure you're aware. And that does set out that SANGs will need to be a major component of the strategy moving forward. And in terms of what's meant by a meaningful proportion, that's being further defined through the work that's ongoing. And as I said, we happily come back to that in more detail later on. If I may, Madam, just perhaps make one further point to clarify Mr. Dagley asking about the safeguarded route for the sustainable transport corridors. I didn't mention it earlier, but in the Council's Matter 8 hearing statement, paragraph 36, or 35 and 36, we are proposing to insert additional text to safeguard the land for the corridors, and there's a map which we're also proposing to insert into the local plan itself to show those routes. So I appreciate no one will have read that yet, but I think it's just worthwhile noting at this stage.
Thank you, Madam. Just one quick question back to Mr. Coleman on that last point about the corridor. It's just the issue. The safeguarded route presumably is also being developer funded, the same as the north-south route. Is there a protocol in place that will ensure that the one doesn't jump ahead of the other?
I think in terms of the detail of how it's going to be delivered, there's further work being undertaken very much through the Garden Town at the moment. What we require in terms of the local plan is that strategic master plans coming forward will recognise these safeguarded routes and will help to facilitate the delivery of the sustainable transport corridors. But the actual kind of on-the-ground delivery is being worked up through further work that's being undertaken through the Garden Town itself at the moment.
Yeah, just wanted to ask two things. One's very simple. Given what Mr. Coleman said about a paper to come before the consideration of the place policies, would he include in that paper, so that we got it before the discussion, whether he would consider safeguarding the line mentioned? That's one. It'd be nice to have that in advance. And the other one is something which is, I was sort of thinking of saying later and picking up on what Mr. Lewin said about car parks. And obviously there's two London Underground car parks, Epping and Loughton, which are proposing, as I understand it, for redevelopment, keeping car parking spaces, possibly increasing them, and adding some new development in. And when we come to the place policies, we'll discuss, I guess, that, and the possibility that the one at Epping could even be larger with the site adjacent to the builder's merchant site. But just when the plan looked at sustainable transport before, there was apparently discussions ongoing with the West Anglia line about something to do with aligning the prices, the fares on that rail service with more like the Central line, which seems to have not happened. All that's happening from the evidence recently presented is that the West Anglia line is thinking of, I think, evening out fares between its ordinary fares and its off-peak fares. There's been a lot of discussion earlier today about the number of people who will commute from Roydon with its own rail station by car to Epping to get on the tube. And the problems, and I know that's been something in the mind of Epping Forest District Council in considering the plan. That's a known reality that's happened for years. When the council does put this paper forward for the place policies, can they please address the idea of differential charging at the car parks, which has been put forward? It is perfectly possible with technology these days that you could charge differential rates for people who are localish to Epping or Loughton station car parks, rather than people who are a long way away, travelling unsustainable commuting by car when they have got a rail station next door to them. You could have almost an inner ring, people who, okay, might need to use the car to get to the station, but not walking distance. And then a lot of other people who are just attracted by the cheap fares because it's part of the Mayor's charging strategy. And the way that could be implemented, because that's obviously the thing with this, is if London Underground is going to be benefiting from redevelopment of its car parks, that would be a way in to have such differential charging. It could be by number plate recognition, no problems at all. I don't know the detail of it, how implementable it is, but it would be nice in the council's paper they're going to produce before the place policies come up, whether they would address the possibility of doing that. Obviously have substantial benefits in terms of long distance commuting.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Stamp. The council's heard Mr. Stamp's points. If you could give some consideration to that to the extent that it's within your control. Thank you. Does anyone else have any points to raise in relation to transport or infrastructure before we end for today? Did the council want to come back on anything that's been said? Okay. Last point.
Sorry, there is one other one very brief point. I remember seeing in the transport stuff that by the end of the plan period, or the end of the transport plan period, it will be okay. You know, there's a few doubts about congestion and emissions, like that, and we don't know what the HRA is going to say either. But there's also just a bigger factor about, you know, we've got apparently 12 years to save the planet, the world, and everything else. there might need to be a substantial change in behaviour in less than the planned period. And it seems to me, we've been talking about sustainable travel and the fact it isn't being realised, it might be. There might be bigger things coming on us, which actually means changes of behaviour. And it could be quite painful in districts where you haven't got much choice in the car, but in a district where you have got some choice, and it will be less painful to people to do different patterns, to have some more capacity, flexibility in terms of doing more than we might need to sooner than we might expecting. I know it's a bit outside the plan period, but it's something which people don't seem to have taken. It's okay, you know, 20 years' time, we'll all be okay. Oh, no, we should have done it 6 years ago.
Thank you, Mr. Stamp. Thank you. So the hearing today closes at just before 5 o'clock. I expect I'll see many of you here again tomorrow for Greenbelt and flooding. Thank you very much. Good night.